Hello everyone, this is Yana Smakula for Simon Says TM. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana episode. In this video, I'll show you how to turn a focal point image into a stunning background using nothing else but repetition. I'm using the beautiful Elegant Rose stencil set from Simon Says TM. This is a 4-layer stencil that creates a gorgeous rose image. It's a standalone rose. So you have one rose with beautiful leaves and a few rose buds. There are loads of examples on the Simon Says TM website that shows this individual rose, that shows how this stencil is ink blended and stenciled. It creates just one rose. I wanted to see if I could take this stencil and repeat ink blended to create a background for a card or multiple cards. I have picked a few colors of ink. I first thought I would just be using yellow and green, of course, but I later added some pink colors, so you'll see me use additional colors later in the video. I'm going to do my ink blending on a large sheet of paper. Typically, if we make a background, we start with the size of the background that will create our card. So if we're making an A2 card, that's going to be 4¼ by 5½ inches. If we're making a 5x7 card, we start with a 5x7 inch panel or, 6x6 and so on. This time I decided if I'm doing all of this ink blending, I might as well ink blend a much larger background. So I just took a sheet of paper. This is Nina Solar White, letter size. I did not cut it down. Instead, I decided to ink blend the entire sheet and then cut it into smaller pieces to use for multiple cards. If you're using a letter size piece of cardstock, this will give you 4 backgrounds for A2 cards. So 4¼ by 5½ or 2 backgrounds for 5x7 cards, or 1 background for 6x6 and possibly another one for an A2 card. I ended up cutting this to create 1 5x7 card and 2 A2 cards, and you'll see me do that a little bit later on in this video. I have already started ink blending, and this stencil is very easy to ink blend. You simply need 3 colors or 3 shades of one color, so a light, a medium, and a dark. In my case, I'm using yellow, and I have butter, zest, and honey. I will also use pink and guava, peony, and cherry, and you'll also need at least 1 green color. I first wanted to use Perfection, but later decided to also bring in the celery color to have a lighter green and a darker green variation on my card. There is only 1 stencil layer to ink blend the leaves and the stems for the roses, but you can definitely add a little bit of depth to your coloring, to your ink blending, if you are using 2 shades of green, a lighter and a darker. This stencil is rather delicate. It does make sense to use stencil adhesive if you have it and spray the back of your stencil with adhesive. That will make holding the stencil, especially those little delicate parts in place, a much easier job. I did not want to do the spray adhesive on the back of my stencil because I knew I'd be repositioning it many times to create the full background here. So I skipped that and I simply used my fingers to hold the delicate parts of the stencil in place. I'm also not using any of the sticky mats, no grip mats here because my paper is obviously much larger than my stencil. So I'm just working on my glass mat, and I'm holding the stencil down in place using tape and also magnets. I'm working on a magnetic glass mat, but you can simply use tape if you have a regular work surface. I'm being careful and ink blending the ink using each stencil layer. I also used a pencil and I marked the corners of my stencil as I was doing ink blending. Later on, as I was building the background, I wasn't able to add corner marks everywhere because some corners were already overlapping the ink blended flowers. So instead, I just added pencil marks where it made sense. And that made it a lot easier for me to align the stencil layers as I was doing the ink blending. because in the end, it was a lot of ink blending. I did enjoy the process. It was very therapeutic. It was very relaxing. I enjoyed blending. I enjoyed experimenting with the colors. I enjoyed doing different flower orientations on my card, on my background, but it really was a lot of ink blending because there are 4 layers to each flower. And as you can see, I ended up having a lot of flowers on my card. I also did not ink blend the greenery, the leaves and the stems completely. This rose is a rose on a stem, and I did not need the stem. I simply needed the flower, I needed some of the leaves, and I needed the flower buds. By the way, I also did not ink blend the flower buds with each of the roses that I was blending. So I sort of tried to alter my flowers as much as possible. Of course, all of the flowers are the same, but I altered the position of the leaves and I altered the position of the flower buds and little things like that where I had control over where and how they looked. So I'm only going to show you how I ink blended the first rose in detail, but I'm not going to show you the ink blending of the entire background. I didn't film the entire process because that did take quite a lot of time, but it's very repetitive. Like I said, we're doing repetition here. So we need to ink blend one rose. I did start in the center because whenever I'm working on a background that has a lot of repetitive elements, I like to start in the center and then just work my way out. I find that a lot easier versus starting in the corner and then, building that way. Once you are done ink blending your first rose, remember to erase those pencil marks because they might end up getting confusing as you do more blending and as you add more pencil marks to your background. So with that done, I repositioned my stencil, I added more pencil marks, and I kept on blending. At this point, as you can see, I'm still using yellows, and at first, I was set on using just the yellow colors for this card. I wanted a yellow and a green background, but as I was working on my background, as I was blending the flowers, I decided I needed some variety. It was getting a little bit too boring for me, and I also wanted to bring additional contrast. I wanted to add a little bit more, some additional shadows to the petals. So I first brought in the peony color and I deepened the shadows on some of the roses. Of course, that ended up not being pink because if you layer pink over yellow, you will actually end up having orange color. But that orange worked for me because it just added, a deeper orange color, a deeper, warmer yellow color, and darkened the shadows on some of the roses. And I quite like that. I would also suggest you go ahead and wash your hands quite often when you work on a background like this, because it's very easy to create smudges and leave inky fingerprints on your background. So just make sure your hands are as clean and ink-free as possible. You will see that I ended up having some ink smudges and some little boo-boos on my background, but I didn't really care because I knew I would be, first of all, cutting this background up. I knew I would be adding sentiments on top and some additional ink blending. So that worked for me, but it never hurts to be careful and wash your hands to make sure there is no ink there. So here I'm ink blending one of those pink roses and I'm using guava. That was my lightest pink, then peony, the medium pink, and I used cherry for the darkest pink to create those dark shadows. I loved making this background. I used to do this sort of ink blending a lot in the past, and I've missed this. It's been a long time since I've made a background like this, and I'm so glad that I came across this stencil from Simon Says TM, and I'm glad I gave this idea a try. I did overlap some of my images. At first, I was trying to do as little overlapping as possible. I tried to make sure that the images would only bear barely kiss each other, but later I decided, it's a little bit of overlapping is not going to hurt. So that's what I did. I overlapped some of the images. You can see that there's just a little bit of leaves overlapping and a few of the flower buds overlapping as well. So here's a look at my background. It's beautiful. I love all of that color. Looking back at this background now, maybe it would have looked even better if I introduced another color. Maybe if I had, some peach roses added here, but nonetheless, I quite like the way this turned out. I used my paper trimmer, and like I said, I cut this background into 3 pieces. So I have 2 backgrounds for A2 cards, and then I have one larger background for a 5x7 card. I have been enjoying making the larger size cards lately, and I was needing a Mother's Day card, and this background felt like it was just the perfect background for a Mother's Day card for my mom. I cut this one to 5x7. With that done, I pre-planned my sentiments. I used several different stamp sets from Simon to create the sentiments, and I also decided to add a little bit of extra ink blending. So for the 5x7 background, I simply used the guava ink and my blending brush. By the way, I'm using the large blending brushes from Simon Says Stamp and also the small blending brushes here to do the ink blending. And I just added a tiny bit of faint light pink ink blending around the edges. This helped tie everything together. This helped direct the eye of the viewer to the center of the card. By the way, I did trim this background to, 4 3/4 inches by 6 3/4 inches. And I foam mounted this onto a 5x7 card base, and that gave me a nice white border on my card. Now for the A2 backgrounds, I used another stencil. I wanted to do this technique where I would layer another image over the main image, and I used the delicate Lattice stencil, and again, that same blending brush and that same ink color, the guava, and I added just a tiny bit of ink blending, mostly over the white areas. The ink blending does overlap the other ink blended images. Obviously, I didn't do any masking here. I wanted this to be very soft and very subtle. So I used a very light hand, very little pressure, very little ink, and I added barely visible Lattice ink blending around the edges. So that was this card. And then for the last card, I went a little bit heavier with my ink blending, and I also added some regular pink ink blending around the edges. As for the sentiments, I used the Mother's Day stamp set from Simon and the coordinating die to create this sentiment. It says, "On this Mother's Day, I hope you know how much you are loved." And then for the other 2 cards, I used the With Thanks stamp set with the coordinating dies, and I stamped "Thank you" and "Thanks." And I also added the stamping in the corners of those cards to create a frame, or the illusion of the frame, if you will. I loved making these cards. I loved playing with the stencil. I loved creating the beautiful sentiments. The sentiments, by the way, were stamped using the VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto that same Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. They were cut out using the coordinating dies in my Platinum 6 die cutting and embossing machine, and they were foam mounted onto the cards using foam adhesive squares. So that's a look at the projects I have for you today, featuring the repetition and ink blending. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you feel inspired to create. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys, and I'll see you again next time.
I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at SimonSaysStamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.